So now we can get on with the order of the day. And could I ask Dr. Naweed Syed to please come and speak to us. Dr. Naweed Syed is professor and head cell biology and anatomy and the research director at Hotchkiss Bryan Institute and a leading research institute in brain chip interfacing, whatever that might be. I would be very honored if you could enlighten me on what that is. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, respected Yar Abbas, distinguished guests. It's a really tremendous privilege and an honor for me to be in the company of so many elite scholars who have come from India. And I'd like to thank you all for coming to Calgary and welcome you. I think it's also a very unique moment for all of us to celebrate Josh from an English perspective, and I think this has never really been done. And the idea was to enable all of you or attract all of you towards Josh's reading and writings and and get your personalized perspective, because I think we run the risk when we try to interpret things on our own and then try to impose those onto others who are sitting in the audience. You know, one of the poet always said that abstract art के मलबे से ये दौलत निकली, मैं तो समझा था अनानास वो औरत निकली, नक्शे महबूब मुसव्विर ने सजा रखा था, इस सफाई से कि तपाई पे घड़ा रखा था. I think it all depends on interpretations. In my paper, I will try to avoid all of this, and I think I will give you some flashes of what I think Josh was trying to convey to us. But I think it's incumbent upon all of us to go and try to read, and I think that was really the purpose of this conference. But I think it always, as you have seen, is the case. Somebody said कि वो बरसी की थी बिरयानी बनी थी जो मसाले में, चुने थे सबने चावल बैठ के दिन के उजाले में. That's what we did yesterday as well. चुने थे सबने चावल बैठ के दिन के उजाले में, नहीं मालूम क्यों आता था कंकर हर नवाले में, खुदा बख्शे बहुत सी खूबियाँ थी मरने वाले में. So I hope our presidium here wouldn't make Josh Somnath ka mandir. And then we get into this confrontation. I'll try to keep my paper really focused on Josh. And once again, with the disclaimer that I'm not a literary scholar, I'm a neuroscientist. I mess with brain and try to understand how brain functions, and also try to understand how elite investigators or elite scientists or elite scholars, what actually provides the substratum for their brain to become intellectuals. So the topic of my talk is Scanning the Brain of an Intellectual, Josh the Immortal. Now, Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky once said, the act of putting spoken words and unspoken thoughts into written words releases and in the process changes the thoughts themselves. As humans evolve to use written language more and more precisely to convey their thoughts, their capacity to abstract thoughts and more novel ideas accelerated. Now, genetic studies on human evolution have revealed that novel thoughts come easy for those who have mastered the art of languages. Shabar Hassan, Josh Malihabadi is then the epic of such human intellect. He had an innate propensity for languages and thus could capture an idea, a scene, feeling, and emotion in a manner that was inconceivable to others. Myriad brilliant minds have written amply about Josh, who was undoubtedly one of the greatest minds to have ever lived on the Indian subcontinent. Josh's intellectual brilliance not only empowered Urdu language to acquire its current literary stature, but also to unravel the mysteries of nature, lessons of history, the underpinnings of philosophy and human conscience. Unfortunately for someone like myself, Josh's writing is not easy to understand. He creates words the way God created the universe, seamlessly and effortlessly. His vision and wisdom do not conform to the norm. His cognitive and perceptual intricacies have no bounds. He sees the unseen. He hears the unheard. He speaks the unspoken. He challenges the dogma, incites curiosity, and his rebellious nature justifies the very existence of his being. Josh has always denounced the cult of personality, backward thinking, lethargy, ignorance, hatred, conjecture, bias and base desires, traditional outlook to the life, cultural and spiritual bounds, all of which short-circuit the very spirit of the human intellect. While Josh's magical and spellbinding command over language mesmerizes its readers, his creative instinct is independent of ideas to thoughts that are increasingly autonomous, transformative, and ultimately independent of the text. At another time in history, these attributes would have sufficed to earn him the stature of a saint. Unfortunately, the people of his own tribe betrayed his intellectual curiosity, human spirit, and independent thinking, only because they did not conform to so-called traditional cult of the time. Any other nation would have taken tremendous pride and privilege to nominate him for Nobel Prize, whereas his own people continued to ignore his literary and intellectual contributions. Incited by this very spirit of fairness, honesty, freedom of thoughts that Josh Sahib's writing has instilled in me, I am gathering courage to devote this article to his legacy, not his memory. Not his memory, because I think memory is for those who are mortal. Josh, in my humble view, is immortal. This article is neither a review of his literary work nor a critique of his personality. This I leave to the experts. I will, however, attempt to share my thoughts vis-a-vis how a brilliant mind such as that of Josh may have been structurally configured to provide the substratum for his mental energy that has encapsulated and enlightened curious minds for centuries. A memorable scene in Carlos Zafran's Shadow of the Wind depicts a scenario in which young protagonist Daniel is introduced to his first deep experience with books, as his father takes him to find his own personal volume in a mysterious library. Welcome to the cemetery of books, Daniel. Every book, every volume has a soul. The soul of a person who wrote it and of those who read it and lived and dreamed with it. Every time a book changes hands, every time someone runs his eyes down its pages, its spirit grows and strengthens. Notwithstanding an early exposure, childhood exposure to Josh Sahib's poetry, the person who literally and figuratively presented Josh to many of us as a gentle giant of human spirit is Iqbal Haidar. Iqbal Bhai's love and commitment towards Josh Sahib's literary contributions is difficult to measure, even if I were to borrow a few letters from Josh's own dictionary. It does nevertheless speak to the sense of payback that Iqbal Bhai felt that he owed not only to Josh Sahib as a decent individual, but more importantly to the fragrance of human values and foresight that he acquired in the company of this great mentor. I dare not dedicate this article to Josh Sahib. I have therefore opted to credit this paper to Iqbal Bhai, who provided me with all necessary encouragement to peek into the beautiful mind of this individual. Physically speaking, Josh is not among us today. So to gain insights into his brilliant mind, one would therefore have to rely upon the intellectual transformations that are brought about in us by his reading and his written work. One would hope that these insights would serve as a remarkable petri dish, which when viewed under a microscope would serve as a scanner, enabling us to examine how he perceived things and then captured their essence and spirit through words. the immortality of his intellectual contributions has since served him well, and he lives in our thoughts vicariously as Josh the Immortal. Such an examination, however, requires multiple perspectives: ancient and modern linguistics, archaeology, history, literature, education, psychology, and neuroscience. The goal of this article is to integrate these disciplines to present new perspectives on the working of a marvelous mind, and that not only created new knowledge, but also played a pivotal role in its dissemination. Marian Wolf said, "Reading enables us to leave our consciousness and pass over into the consciousness of another person, another age, another culture." Now this passing over, a term coined by theologian John Donne, describes the process through which reading enables us to try to identify with and ultimately enter for a brief time the wholly different perspective of another person's consciousness. When we pass over into how a knight thinks, how a slave feels, how a hero behaves, we never come back quite the same. We are transformed. We never come back quite the same way, because sometimes we are inspired and other times we are saddened, but we are always enriched. Now through this process we learn about the commonality and the uniqueness of our thoughts, that are not individuals, that we are individuals but not alone. The moment this happens, we are no longer limited to the confines of our thinking. Wherever they were set, our original boundaries are challenged, teased, and gradually placed somewhere else. Nowhere else is this more evident than Josh Maliavadi's Yadon Ki Barat, whose several earlier volumes he himself first blessed to the trash can before being compelled to publish the edition that is in print today. Now this supports the notion that Josh's brilliance has reached an evolutionary perfection of human thoughts, as even today his work remains unchallenged. This article has benefited a great deal from his book Yadon Ki Barat. Once I talked to the world-renowned scholar Dr. Kalbi Sadiq, who pointed out to me that he was reading Yadon Ki Barat on his way back to Lucknow, and he was so entranced and taken over by this book that people had to remind him that his train had already stopped his home station and he was about to leave. And I think Josh has left this kind of impact on all the people who have tried to explore his intellectual curiosity and peek into his mind. And I think it has been consistent with all the intellectuals you have seen today, you've heard today, people who are so dedicated and devoted that they are willing to commit time which is the most precious, to try to pay their respect to Josh Sahib. Now in instances where a scientist or a physician or a surgeon doesn't have the luxury of reading one's mind through one's written text, it may help to gain insights into the workings of such a marvelous and beautiful mind by examining the functional working of his or her brain, the mecca of one's intellectual thoughts. Now here I will attempt to shed some light and into the structural organization that might have formed the basis of the wiring of this marvelous brain. Marcel Proust once said, "We feel quite truly that our wisdom begins where that of the author's ends, and we would like to have him give us answers, while he can only give us desires. And these desires he can arouse in us only by making us contemplate the supreme beauty which the last effort of his art has permitted him to reach, but by a law which perhaps signifies that we can receive the truth from nobody, and then we must create it ourselves. That which is the end of their wisdom appears to be as the beginning of ours." Now Proust's understanding of the generative nature of reading contains, however, a paradox. The goal of reading is to go beyond the author's ideas to thoughts. This is, however, not feasible in the case of Josh Sahib, whose vision is infinite and wisdom beyond grasp. In this case, therefore, one doesn't run the risk of interpreting his work beyond the conceptual and intellectual framework in which Josh had initially orchestrated in his written work. While writing these articles, I would like to offer a disclaimer and caution the audience that although they may get a bird's eye view of this brilliant mind through the CT scan of my limited knowledge in the field of brain research, that is not limited vision, whereas Josh Sahib's intellectual depth is infinite and beyond comprehension. Now, throughout history, neuroscientists, psychologists have proposed numerous theories to define the biological basis of intelligence, and these ranged from large brain sizes, lateral frontal cortex, large inferior parietal region, and large size of the white matter. For instance, Albert Einstein's brain size was average. His superior parietal region, which is thought to be involved in mathematical reasoning, was about 15% wider on both sides of his brain. Now, if his overall brain size did not differ from an ordinary man, and then this extra 15% would have had to come from somewhere else. Something had to give in. And Albert Einstein's brain was found to have smaller perisylvan region, which is responsible for linguistic intelligence. Now, perhaps it was this change which was responsible for his meager linguistic and communication abilities. For instance, he could not speak until the age of 3, whereas most children can speak when they are 1 or 2 years of age. Similarly, at the age of 16, he failed language exams of the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. And even as an adult, he was terrified of speaking in public. He was an abysmal speaker. While these theories based on either the size of any given brain region, white matter, etc., could never be tested experimentally, they do nevertheless suggest that there might exist various different forms of intelligences, each unique to an individual. In addition, some forms of intelligence have very unique specific networks of brain cells that are dedicated to select mental faculties. An interplay between various different brain regions is likely to be required for the master intelligence, thus enabling one to excel simultaneously in various different disciplines that require an interplay between networks of brain cells. In the case of Josh, while it remains unknown whether any given regions of his brain were significantly different or larger, we know for sure that he would have to have mastered the art of reading, writing, comprehension, cognition, and verbal communication faculties. While some aspect of his intellect may have been inherited and acquired through the genetic interplay of his parental gene pool, it is apparent that his environment played a critical role in shaping the final connectivity maps of his brain. He was well versed in Urdu language, several languages, Urdu, Persian, Hindi, Arabic, and he had mastered command over alphabets, which he used to either create new words or strung the existing vocabulary into sentences and phrases that are still masterpieces of Urdu poetry. To understand how Josh might have given new meanings to older words and stretched the limits of human cognition, thereby creating new windows for novel imagination, it is important to understand how the nurturing. Speaking to you, I am the presynaptic cell, you are the postsynaptic cell, you are the recipient of that information, and this microphone is that synapse through which we communicate. So the brain actually communicate in this manner, and this is really important for the connectivity patterns. In a young baby's brain, there are 30,000 synapses every 10 minutes. And the environment that a baby or a child is exposed to will help build that network of connectivity, which will provide the intellectual basis. And I think in case of Josh Sahab, this was really important because he was in an environment that encouraged all the learning aspects of it, and that enabled to form the basis of synaptic connectivity. So some of it is genetics. So if you look at rats that are raised in laboratories for generation, now no one tells this baby rat that, mama, this cat is furry, smelly stuff is dangerous for you. But whenever this rat will see cat, it freezes. This is similarly when a deer is hit by floodlight, it freezes. Nobody teaches it that particular response. These are innate responses that are built into our circuitry, and they are genetically determined. They play a very important role for our survivals. Almost all of us have it. But then the sensory inputs, and then all your hawasi khamsa that we often neglect, that Josh did not rely upon, most certainly play a very pivotal role. So if you take a kitty cat and you put a patch over one of its eye, and you let the visual tactile pathway develop, this cat will never see from that eye. It's blind for life. Similarly, individuals who cannot hear, they cannot speak. So these sensory inputs, they play a very pivotal and central role in the wiring of the brain, and they are all environmental factors that will contribute. And I think these were some of the major contributors for wiring Josh's brain. So you have to really think it from the perspective that the genes play a very important role to wire, which everybody has the same brain, the network connectivity, but then the sensory input and your ability to capture these sensory input will shape the final outputs of our brain. And any perturbation of this early exposure and connectivity will result in Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, and autism and learning disabilities. So I think our ability also to modulate these synapses that are formed, and I can assure you at the end of this conference you would have gotten several million synapses that will form the basis of learning. And this learning and memory is very important for our cognitive faculties. So some of you might have absorbed this information better than others. And as a result, you empower your brain with these unique information that is stored in your brain, which could be retrieved and recalled as you need it. So I think a failure for these networks to establish would result in a mind which is often demented and creates lots of problems that Josh could foresee. And I think Josh had inherited both the intelligence, which is the genetic component, as well as the exposure to reading and learning multiple languages, which when coupled with his real life experiences created a dynamic combination of intellectual mastery over human conscious vision and wisdom. As Rene Richardson noted, we cannot harvest much intelligence without wisdom, but there is very little wisdom in the unintelligent. He further points out that intelligence is the ability to manipulate the knowledge that has been obtained for one's own purpose. And I think this should be my take-home message to you. I will say this again. It therefore stands to reason. He further points out that intelligence is the ability to manipulate the knowledge that has been obtained for one's own purpose. It therefore stands to reason that Josh Sahab must have taken a keen interest, very keen interest, and a personal interest in every aspect of his life, not from a bird's eye view, rather with the intent to understand and reflect. This empowered his sensory perception with microscopic ability to see the unseen, whereas his higher learning and memory and cognitive functions were to store and retrieve this information in a blink of an eye. To rephrase, we are all born with unique building blocks that form the substratum for our personalized intelligence, all submerged into the pool of sensory input. Our early exposure to such sensory exposure and the ability to retain, organize, and manipulate the stored sensory information at a rapid pace endows our brain to easily manipulate a composition, language, invention, an idea, or a design. This concept is perhaps best personified in Josh Malihabadi. Thank you very much.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Really. I never looked at Josh from that perspective. Thank you very much, Dr. Naseem Syed. Really?
Naweed Syed.
Dr. Naweed Syed. Dr. Naweed Syed, I still don't know what brain chip interfacing is, and you no, don't get up. That's all right. You didn't explain it, but whatever it might be, it seems to have done wonders for your brain. And I'm just wondering whether there is any hope for me, because I keep forgetting. I don't know whether you were here yesterday. Were you?
Yes.
Yes. You know that my ailment, shall I call it?
I wish we only had 5% of what you have.
No, I just cannot remember the names. So, all I can say is once again, thank you very much, Dr. or whatever you might. Thank you.